Welcome back to Incremental, the continuous improvement podcast. I'm Uriel Eisen.
And I'm Devin Bedoni.
And this is our concepts edition. And today's focus is sort of around in-house versus sending stuff out, building custom machines and custom solutions, kind of wrestling with some of that at the moment. So I thought it would be interesting to talk through. Very confusing sometimes reading the books and how they talk about it versus my experience. And not just my experience, also just the advice of like focus on what you're good at and stuff like that. Right. So just squaring that circle.
I think it often comes back to our scale compared to the scale most of these books are written about. I think it's important to always keep that perspective.
Right.
And just remember that we are very resource strapped in all ways: time, money, personnel, expertise. So it's you got to take everything with a grain of salt and think about it as a hopeful future state.
I just feel like I can argue it every which way.
Wait, you can argue against the scales thing, or you can argue
like I should build this in-house, or I should buy it, and you can sort of come up with a very good argument for either one. You had a quote?
I do. This is a joke I heard from an engineer when I was a kid, but it's topical. The optimist sees a glass half full. The pessimist sees a glass half empty. And the engineer sees a glass that's twice as big as it needs to be. And this is maybe relating to actually that. It's like, it's good to remember that, you can't, I think the point of that is just to remember that to look realistically at the current state, and not be too focused on an potentially unrealistic future state, or trick yourself into what your current state is even.
Right.
And I do think this is really common both in theory of constraints and lean is like really, and TPS is really establishing what is the current state and what is our ideal state. And most of us are not that good at that, myself included. I think I'm very prone to focusing on the future ideal state without recognizing what my current state is and what the necessary steps are to get from here to there.
Yeah, definitely. I've been reading a couple books, and there's a lot of talk. This is something that's sort of been on my mind, is like the step one of problem solving, sort of like A3 or Toyota. I'm forgetting there's a term for this. It's like an 8-step process. That's sort of an expanded PDCA, plan, do, check, act. And I think I often don't spend enough time on the drilling down on exactly what is the problem. And Shigeo Shingo talks about means and ends, and that you should improve the ends, not the means, which is a little confusing because I'll give an example, but because means and ends are sort of interchangeable depending on the scale you're looking at. And so like searching for food is a means to an end, the end being eating. But eating is actually also a means to an end, which is staying alive, and so on and so forth. And so it's not necessarily a great filter, but I think of like we've sort of talked about degreasing in my shop a bit, and coming up, and I think most of the time I've spent is thinking about how to speed up the degreasing process. And then our friend Avi reached out and was like, can you degrease in the tumbler? And I was like, yeah, probably, right? And I think I just lost focus on the ends, which is having parts that are ready for paint. It's not about perfecting the degreasing process. It's like about how the parts need to be.
I think that's really true.
The other thing I like about this quote, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, is the lack of judgment. Right? It doesn't matter it's not about a more like, you don't have to moralize it. It's just like being realistic, and it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not like, oh, bummer, or, oh yeah, this is so great. It's just like, this is where we are.
This is where we are, and our glasses.
Yeah. Why are we spending money on so much extra glass?
Yeah. Good question. All right. Starting us off here, I have, the phrase, what gets measured gets managed, or people like more measurement results in more action or something like that. Mm-hmm. And the issue there is that too many measurements, no one knows what to focus on. And so I think Goldratt talks about this, and then also in the in Designing the Future they talk about it, where basically in Designing a Future, I believe they talk about a maximum of 5 metrics, and all those metrics need to be in someone's control.
Sure.
And they, anecdotally, they were talking to some people who had like, I forget, one lady had like 150 metrics, like key metrics, right? Everyone talks about KPIs and whatever. It's like these 150 key metrics. I'm reminded of the quote, if you have more than 3 priorities, you don't have priorities. It's like you have to keep it really, really basic. And I feel this way a little bit for myself. It's like the second it's like, okay, this month we're going to focus on sales. And then 2 days later, it'll be like, we also really need to focus on improving our cycle times. Right. And then 2 days later, you just keep adding things you're really focusing on, or, really want to measure about the business.
I was reading some more about just some like internet reading about theory of constraints, trying to kind of dive into it a little bit more.
Yeah, same.
Last night. And that seems like a key aspect of all of Goldratt's stuff is like simplicity, like boil this down to its simplest, key principles. And it's like we spend a lot of time thinking about the production side and the bottleneck, but another like a key principle of the theory of constraints, like methodology, is using throughput accounting. And throughput accounting is like, its whole thing also is reducing the number of measurements.
Right.
So you just have 4, or I think I'll just read. Actually, it's only 3. We talked about this a little bit last couple weeks ago, I think. Mm-hmm. But throughput, investment / what used to be called inventory. They've, I think, broadened that term to include all investment.
Smart.
And operating expense. And it's like those 3 things at the end of the day tell you all you need to know. You may need, in terms of like the health of the business as a whole. Right. You may need to dive into specifics here and there sometimes to pull information out, but they're not indicative of the health of the business. They may be indicative of some small aspect of a process or something.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember like Goodhart's principle. Once something becomes a metric, it becomes a bad metric.
Right.
And ideally, those metrics that he's identified, I think he puts a lot of time into thinking about like the units and the like what you're actually measuring. And so the goal there is, I think he has another quote that I pulled out. I forget if we've talked about it on the podcast, but every measurement needs to, like optimize for the best outcomes of the business or something like that. Mm-hmm. Right. Like if you give someone a measurement to hit, them doing a good job needs to relate to the business performing well. And the problem is that a lot of people talk about metrics that actually don't. Yeah. For example,
or don't in isolation.
Like you guys need to produce more stuff.
Right.
And then it's like, all right, we'll get really good at that. And then it's like, wow, you just made a ton of inventory. Mm-hmm. That's going to mess us up.
I think where people often get lost is that most of the metrics that are identified do further the goal in theory, but when focused on in isolation, they don't.
Right.
And so I think that's part of having this kind of broad 30,000 foot view.
Yeah.
Is that it kind of takes the noise out of that so that you can't focus on any one and get an unrealistic picture. If you were to like to imagine every one of those little metrics as being a pixel, if you like zoom in too much and it's just like, let's just make this one big, and then you zoom out and you're like, whoa, that doesn't look right. But if you zoom out, you can kind of like see the whole pixelated picture.
Yeah, and I think you need
clearly
to stay zoomed out.
Yeah.
Even if at times you zoom in. But
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. I think the other piece is just which metrics are easy to get, right? And a lot of the metrics I think people pick, which we've talked about, are based on what's easy.
Yeah.
Right.
I had a meeting with a potential bookkeeper this last week, and that was part of it, where she was like, so how in depth do you want to get on, on your like costing and, kind of performance stuff? And I was like, well, at the end of the day, the business is kind of simple. And she was like, well, manufacturing can get kind of complicated if you're like tracking every product. And I was like, oh yeah, no, we're not going to do that. Like, we make a different thing every other day.
Right.
Like, we need to just be looking at, the overall business. And we're going to be kind of trying to dial in our general net profit and our general cost of goods. And if we try and zoom in too much, it's just going to become a nightmare.
Right. I could imagine with paperless parts, etc., I could imagine it being useful to have some feedback between
definitely
quoting a job and then the actual net profit on that job. I can also imagine it being really hard to figure out because it's not like you're working on one thing in isolation at a time.
No, we're just, that's one big hope for me in moving into new quoting software, is trying to build in some feedback loops. But like you just said, we can only kind of zoom in on a couple aspects of that.
Yeah.
And at least try and like bring those closer to parity, where it's like, if I see a common, like, I always quote 10 minutes under what a thing takes to run, that's a very easy thing to bring into parity, and it does have a big effect.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like trying to account for every aspect of a job that we run, that's a much bigger lift. Maybe we'll get there someday, but
it seems really hard to deal with like labor allocation, because it's easy to look at like machine time, but it's not as easy to figure out that one part was super fast to set up and keep running and the other part was really complex.
Labor allocation, tooling allocation, like general shop overhead allocation, like it turns into,
right.
I guess some of those things you can sort of, like general overhead allocation, you could maybe divide by time and sort of distribute that.
Yeah, that would be pretty rough, because like if something was really small and barely takes up any space in the shop, and then something else is really big, I don't know. Yeah,
it's interesting.
Yeah, for sure. It sort of leads into a question I have a comment here written down about the issues of cost accounting. Also a Gold Rat special. He's enemy number one, cost accounting.
Public enemy number one.
Yeah. And I was just thinking, so we're pushing kind of hard to get our overnight runs to be a reality.
Yeah.
So we just got up to a 4-hour run time, and then the next step is aimed at a 16-hour, which would be huge.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about cost accounting is, if you look at our spreadsheet, the cost of those parts does not go down at all.
Yeah.
Which is wrong.
Well,
because if we can throughput double the stuff suddenly, there's no way that you could say that the business is the same.
Yeah.
Right, because our fixed costs don't go up.
Yeah, that I've been confused about as well, about how to handle this. Because I've heard people say, well, you don't charge any less. You just make a better profit on the stuff that you make.
Yeah.
On the other hand, in a competitive market,
right,
if other people are doing the same thing and you're still trying, and they can lower their costs on their product because of this and still maintain a viable business, and you're not, then you'll be pushed out of the market. So I don't really know like where the balance is. And I've heard, I've read a lot of articles where referencing automation mostly, where shops will say, this is like moving to overnight runs and fully automated is the only thing, and lowering our costs because of it is the only thing that's allowed us to compete with overseas manufacturing. So clearly they're lowering costs.
Right.
And where do we land? I struggle with this as well, like looking at a project and being like, okay, should we just quote it as is, or should I quote it with the assumption that we're going to try and automate it and make it cheaper? Or
yeah, I mean, my suspicion is that you shouldn't start off by making it cheaper, because there's a huge investment in time and money to make it automated.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's no way, and our spreadsheet does have a way of accounting for this. We have a whole spreadsheet on what to essentially bill the CNC time at.
Yeah.
And that is heavily reliant on how many hours it runs per year.
Uh-huh.
Right. Like the more it runs per year, the less each hour costs.
Yeah.
Essentially. But yeah, I just think like it's such a glaring example of the issues with cost accounting. And like having good metrics, and I don't know what the answer is at all internally. Like, what do we do?
Right.
Like, if we do succeed in running nearly 24 hours a day instead of 8 hours a day, like that is a huge difference.
Yeah.
But our theoretical cost of goods doesn't change. The theory and practice are the same in theory.
Are the same in theory.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, it is confusing. And cost accounting would say run it as much as possible to drive that price down. Like the more you run it, the less each unit costs, because the machine costs a certain amount per year.
Yeah.
That's, one of the examples of a key reason of key driver of overproduction and cost accounting is like run this machine so that it's making money theoretically.
Right. In our case, it would be making money.
Yeah.
But the reason the price doesn't really go down in our current spreadsheet, well, maybe it's just not a good enough spreadsheet. I don't know. Because like we don't have, it's not like we're going to then, pay out that much more in labor.
Yeah.
We're all going to come in the morning and start processing parts in an 8-hour day.
Uh-huh.
So there's no way that it just scales linearly.
Yeah. 100%. If anybody has any feedback.
We'd love to hear it. Yeah. This is like blind leading the blind over here. So it was just pretty striking after reading and then seeing it so vividly.
Yeah.
I talked to someone, reached out on Instagram about some production issues I was having around pins. I ended up setting up a little phone call with them. I might get these numbers wrong, but they worked at a cigarette manufacturing company in high-speed manufacturing.
Yeah.
They were running lines that did, I want to say, 2,200 parts a minute.
Wow. Parts being cigarettes?
They were doing cigarettes and e-cigarettes.
Yeah, okay.
Wow. But kind of mind-blowing. I've been trying to figure out how to get my cycle times down. I've been staring at the machine, and you just see so many, like, a few seconds here, a few seconds there that could be eliminated. And if I eliminated them, again, going back to our cost of goods, like that would substantially change our cost of goods.
Or more importantly, substantially change your throughput.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Something like that. I don't know. Yeah. It's a little.
Are we looking at the head side or the tail side of this coin?
Yeah. Well, it's just funny because it's not a true bottleneck. And so my pauses are sort of like when you're building a company, you want to be pricing things. There's two pressures. One is to price things high enough so that in the long run, it is a real business, right? And people often make the mistake of like, oh, I'm one guy in my garage. My rent is zero.
I'm just going to come in and cut under the market. And
and it's like, wow, I get so busy. And then you try to scale that, and it's like, oh, this is not profitable. And then on the flip side, you don't want to integrate your very high costs or very low utilization of equipment or any of this other stuff, and then ask customers to pay a crazy high premium for the fact that you're just figuring stuff out,
I was going to interrupt you real quick. Do you feel like you have a solid idea of what using theory of constraints methodology of like what your constraint, what your like hard bottleneck is in your business? Or do you feel like it's many different places still?
Well, I think I don't know how to think about this,
Yeah.
I guess. And I'll talk through it. Basically, on the one hand, there is a it's not a hard constraint, but the CNC mill, if we try to scale our production, is the one piece that is a serious cash investment. Right. To get our throughput up. Everything else is pretty straightforward.
To scale.
In numbers. That being said, every single one of those projects involves time. And so you could argue that time is our bottleneck. So that's the thing I sort of flip back and forth on. It's like getting overnight runs going is my time sitting there programming stuff, thinking through failure modes, all that stuff, doing test runs, right? Mm-hmm. I can either be doing that or I can be developing new products. Mm-hmm. I think revenue-wise, new products are going to be very impactful. Mm-hmm. But I also know that getting our throughput up and decreasing our costs could potentially be very big as well. So the question is, what do I put the time into? And that is throttling the business. Yeah. So if we're just looking at straight numbers of how many buckles can we make in this space, the mill is the constraint. I can buy new tumblers. Each tumbler is like $265 if you go with the cheap ones.
Yeah. You can add a paint station and a person.
We're not super limited on.
Yeah.
Like we paint for an hour a day.
Oh.
So it's like, that would be easy.
Interesting.
I mean, again, it's my time, but I could theoretically hire.
Yeah.
I'd love to automate it. Yeah. That is my time as well.
Interesting.
So I don't know. I mean, I'd be curious to hear what you think.
What
is our bottleneck?
I think it's similar. Again, coming back to the scale issue, at this scale, it's easy to focus on production issues and then kind of come to realize that the real constraint of the business as a whole is like a personnel and a time issue.
Yeah.
But I think also important not to lose sight of what the production bottleneck will be, so that as you scale, you're not caught off guard.
Yeah, we're starting to bump up against.
Yeah. So in the milling, the machining of the parts is still sort of the most time intensive per unit, as it were.
I don't think it's just, I think it's a combination of that and the fact that the fix is extremely expensive. Yeah. Right? Like the tumbler is maybe more of a constraint, except that it's really easy to alleviate the constraint.
Yeah. So there's that. Yeah. That.
I don't know how to talk about that, I guess. Like,
I guess I don't know, just reading a little more about TOC the last few days, it's kind of interesting to like walk through how he structures the PDCA loops, sort of, which is kind of like identify the constraint.
Becoming acronym salad over here.
Identify the constraint, then exploit the constraint, which I found the wording a little bit confusing, but that basically means like do everything you can to optimize or offload so that the constraint becomes not a constraint. So if you're like aware that in the production side, tumbling is right now maybe setting the beat, the pace of production, but that is a very easy constraint to exploit if necessary.
Right. Yeah.
And then it seems like your anticipation is that the next constraint you will find will be machining of the parts, and that will sort of set the pace of production until you add another machine or change the process somehow considerably, something along those lines.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But you can't do any of that until you deal with time and personnel problems.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'm in a similar sort of
I mean, hiring Sam, I look back and it's like I should have done that so much sooner, because our revenue hasn't doubled by any means since hiring a second person, but the number of projects we've been able to tackle since he's joined has been huge.
Yeah.
Like really important big projects that are sort of going to determine the future of the company instead of just like keeping up with production basically day to day and like doing some sales and whatever. Like, I don't know. Yeah. Kind of lost time. So
yeah, it's hard.
I'm probably doing the same thing right now also is what I'm kind of maybe realizing.
No, I think I'm in the same
cash flow
spot.
wise, it's tough.
Yeah, I think I really need to add another person. I'm not quite sure what role to add to. And then that we have a kind of a hard constraint of our space.
Right.
Where like there's not a place for another person to park. It's on private property and it's not my property.
Yeah. Standing desk in the yard?
No, I just mean their car.
Oh, I see. Parking that way. Right.
And then in terms of in the shop, yeah, it's like very, very tight. Like already I'm sort of in the way where my desk is.
Right.
If we add another body in there, it's like, how's this going to work? But at the same time, in the last month, the limitations of our flow have become extremely apparent. Having said that, and kind of in regards to adding people, it's been very interesting just to track our gross revenue. I think when I added part-time people, like maybe an additional 3 person days per week. I think the business almost doubled. And then when I brought on a person full time, it did like half again.
Okay.
And then when I added a third person, so that was at the end of this last year, and we're not going to double, but we're on track for like almost doubling.
Wow.
Which is pretty wild to see.
That is.
Because like we've been working on process improvements, et cetera.
Right.
But really that is the big change that's happened in the business is we added another person.
Right. Yeah.
And most of the process improvements have been just to like enable us to actually utilize more people and, kind of get through the work. But it's still astounding to be like, just like, yeah, and we've talked about this in the past, but like person hours really are what drive a business. Without the people there, it's just nothing.
It's nothing. Yeah. I mean, especially when you're growing something.
Yeah.
Then there aren't processes in place. There isn't, I don't know, like you can build a website that can generate revenue, right? Like building a piece of software.
Yeah.
I mean, which is not what we're doing at all. But, right, like there are things that can generate revenue once they're built. But someone's got to build them.
Yep.
Let's see. So speaking of that being the bottleneck, we've sort of been talking and you're like, well, okay. So backing up, we had a pretty bad day of production. I should say lack of production. On Friday, I came in.
Had a bad day of scrap is what you had.
Yeah, I ran pins and I came back to the machine and there were just pins all over the machine.
Yeah. And not good ones, right?
No, really mangled. And looking at them, I was like, I can't even imagine how the mill made this part. Like the chamfer mill went right through the center of the pin. It's meant to sort of just skim the corners off.
Yep.
So then I watched it run, and what was happening is it was pulling the finished pin out of the vise. It was going over to the cup, opening, and the pin wasn't falling out of the gripper.
Yeah.
And then it was going and picking up a second part. So then it had 2 pins and went over to the vise and loaded both in, even though there's only room for one. And that was the problem. So fixed the problem.
How did you, backing up, the gripper fingers, do they have a relief to hold a pin?
Yeah, they have a little relief. Yeah.
So,
on one side.
Interesting. So it was holding, how did it hold 2 pins then? Oh, because the other one would just sort of still be stuck.
Yeah, one was pushed up higher in the gripper and it held them enough. I mean, it didn't look organized, but they were both in the gripper.
It really didn't fall out.
Yeah. And so, anyway, so I reprogrammed it to blast it with a little coolant I cleaned off some gunk that I don't know what it was, that was making it stick, I think.
Interesting.
I don't know if that was dried coolant.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was, but that was interesting. Clean that off. That seemed to fix the problem, but I was like, I really want to fix the problem.
Yeah.
So I added a little blast of coolant, which seems to do the trick. And And then there was some damage to the vice jaws. We built in a basically so you can compensate for tool wear of the jaws. And so I was trying to comp it, and I was like, why is this not changing anything? So I changed the number by a few thousandths of an inch, which is typically plenty. Nothing would happen. I was up to 20 thousandths of an inch, and I was like, okay, something is not right. So I dug through the programs, and it turned out that I had done it for the 3/4 pins, but not for the 1-inch pins.
Yeah.
But I had half done it for the 1-inch pins.
Right.
I just hadn't connected the dots basically in the program. And so it was doing absolutely nothing. So I fixed that. But basically it took me probably 4 or 5 hours of just like futzing around with the program, fixing stuff that it was broken, all this stuff. So it was kind of interesting.
Kind of interesting, kind of crappy.
I mean, it was crappy, but at the same time, like, it's interesting to see what breaks down because like the premise of pushing things to their absolute limit, a big piece of that is everything needs to become more robust, because if you're at the limits and having things break down, it's much less profitable. Like there's that in the Toyota way, I think they talk about like going to single piece flow without having everything in place to do that successfully. And you'll end up with like 80 to 90% downtime.
Yeah. Backing up slightly to the gunk, the sticky gunk. Do you think, like, does the pin material come with stickers on it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Sometimes.
Like, I wonder if there was adhesive somewhere that just like stuck.
We do put E-tape on it for the cutting process.
Oh, interesting.
That could be it.
What if you had a different batch that got hot or something and was leaving residue, sticky residue?
That's a thought.
I don't know. Just seems like an odd.
How many more times do we have to ask why?
Well, you probably have to test that theory first.
Why do we put tape on it? That is a good question.
That is a good. Why do you put tape on it?
Because the way we saw them is silly.
Yes.
And hasn't been solved.
Because you bundle them? Is that why it's taped?
Yeah, we bundle them into 3. And so we tape them together to bundle them, which is all waste.
You tape at one end?
No, we tape 3 side by side.
Side
3
by side.
bars.
But do you just tape the bundle at an end, or you tape along the whole thing?
We put little rings of tape.
Yeah.
Like 3 along the length of it.
Uh-huh.
We just borrowed a bar splitter, I think it's called. Bar parter from anyway, it's basically a little shear with an 1/8 inch hole in it. And you poke it through and it works beautifully. So now we're sort of trying to figure out how to make it automatic.
Yeah.
I was half joking but also not joking about mounting that in the mill and then just using the gripper to increment the bar through it and then just putting a cylinder on it. And then grabbing that one and putting it in. That said, speaking of exploiting the bottleneck, moving cycle time into the mill
bad move.
Bad from that standpoint, but if you look at the global bottleneck of human labor, you could be like, okay, buying a second mill is actually really cheap relative to hiring, which it is.
It is, but I guess I just think that like labor is easy to distribute amongst a lot of tasks.
Yeah, I think like Toyota talks about flexibility. The mill is terrible at packing orders and shipping orders.
Yeah.
It is no good at painting. It is no good at plant improvement. It can't vacuum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think I think getting it out, that process as a whole out of the mill seems like pretty high priority.
The pins.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we were sort of talking through different solutions there.
Yeah, I got excited. I think they could be really cool and maybe not even that complicated.
Yeah, I think you got excited and I got like
overwhelmed
because I'd be the one building that.
Yeah.
And it is exciting, but this gets to the question of like, yeah, I mean, some of the things we talked about, I don't know if you want to.
Sure. Yeah.
Is like having something, I forget exactly all the ones we talked about, but
The idea I had was a shear that drops a pin into a chute or somehow gets it to a gripper.
mm-hmm.
The gripper is on an arm on a swivel, and that runs it through two abrasive wheels that take it to length.
Mm-hmm.
But you've decided that maybe after using that shear, maybe that part's unnecessary, and then so runs them to a station where a grinding wheel on an eccentric, like a conical grinding wheel on an eccentric, does the deburr for the corners.
Yeah.
And yes, we did discuss a lathe, but
Right.
and that, which seems like the obvious solution, but is like,
It's sort of like,
strangely challenging. Like you really end up needing a sub spindle to do this effectively.
yeah. And it just seems like, what's the saying about like crushing a fly with I forget. It's just like overkill. It's insane overkill.
Yeah.
It's like we're doing such a basic thing. The required precision is very low.
Yeah.
It just seems crazy that you'd need like a sub spindle lathe. Yeah, I don't know. I like the idea. I think, I think I've been struggling just generally with this idea of like, do you build stuff in house or do you buy solutions to problems?
Mm-hmm.
Shigeo Shingo talks about the inverse, or that time, and what does he say? It's like time and ingenuity are like make up for each other. And so people often say like we can't because we don't have enough of whatever, and he's basically like, either you spend time fixing that problem
Mm-hmm.
and apply your ingenuity, or you just spend money on it. It's sort of like use your brain, not your wallet.
Uh-huh.
But I don't know if that's good advice, because I only have one brain, and also there's a lot of other people with brains out there who have solved these problems already.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it would be ideal if someone made a machine for pins for pins that were not highly precise,
Yeah.
right? Like there are like precision pin grinding machines. I don't need that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. So I don't know how to think about like,
And we've determined, right, that dowel pins are too expensive
Yeah,
off
yeah.
the shelf.
Precision dowel pins are very expensive
Comparatively.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's kind of weird because, so like talking it through, basically like austere manufacturing is not in the business of designing pin making machines, right? That's not exactly what's making us money.
Mm-hmm.
We are allegedly in the business of making new buckles.
Mm-hmm.
I say allegedly because we made, anyway, we need to release new products. And so do we focus on process improvement, increasing production, all these things, or do you put your time into like the sort of like the unique selling proposition of our business has nothing to do with how we're making the things. I mean, it sort of does, right? We're like CNC'd hardware with this and that, but it's like CNC'd hardware is shorthand for the quality. Yeah. It's not about like, yeah. I don't know. It's very tough. I go back and forth on it.
On the pins. And like,
just generally, like, do we build a lot of custom machines? Because the other side of it is like, there's a lot of, like at some point we're probably going to get knocked off.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're much less likely to get knocked off if you've invested a lot of time successfully in building custom solutions that drive down your costs.
Yeah.
Right.
It's
if like
you're buying dowel pins, anybody can go buy dowel pins and do that.
Right.
And if you're priced accordingly, everybody can just copy that.
Achieve that same pricing.
Yeah. But if you're making a pin that's good enough quality for what you need to do, looks good, and you can get it at a quarter of the cost, not everybody can copy that
and
easily.
it took you a month to build that machine, and you have 20 other machines like it in your space.
Yeah.
You know, there's going to be a lot of head scratching and a lot of work that needs to be put in to catch up. Mm-hmm. And I think already we have some of that, but you know, I'm not going to fool myself and say no one can do what we've done. Right. But I think, so I think there's merit to that too, right? Like you build custom solutions, you build machines that are impactful to what you're doing, and it does give you a competitive edge.
Yeah. I mean, if you come back to TOC, that philosophy would say identify the single constraint in the business and subjugate all other tasks to that. So that, and then once you've solved it, move on to the next. And so
I get that. I feel like similarly to like some of the TPS stuff.
Yeah.
It's sort of like all the examples they talk about are not me.
Yeah.
Right. And so some of it, it's tempting to sort of say, I'm not sure.
Right.
Similarly, TOC, I understand if you walk into a production plant and say like, wow, everything's flowing except this one machine that everything passes through. It's like, that is a really convenient example for TOC.
Yeah.
I am in no way saying that if Goldrat was around and had a look at our shop, that he wouldn't have some very useful
Feedback.
thoughts.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is it's very unclear to me the one bottleneck. If the one bottleneck is labor, does that just mean hire? And maybe the answer is yes.
I guess that's kind of like, not to say that is the solution, but it is an interesting thought experiment to run.
Yeah.
And game out and think about how that would affect the business as a whole. If you've determined that the primary bottleneck in your business is making new products, which seems to come up a lot. That's why I'm using the example.
Unfortunately, it does.
Yeah. And you determine that is genuinely the primary constraint in the growth, the throughput and growth of the business.
Yeah.
And then game out what it would look like if you were to hire somebody, and then it would become pretty clear that making a pin machine is probably something for down the line.
Yeah, and I think that's where it's at, basically, is like, it sort of depends how you want to grow the business, or how I want to grow the business. Right.
Sure. But does it, though? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, because one option would be grow the business by growing production capability of this product.
Yeah.
Until I don't know what the end game there is.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that the former option doesn't negate that potential, that possibility.
What's the former option?
Of hiring someone to add,
to
make it so you could add new products. Then you potentially have multiple products that benefit. Like, say, a lot of your products are probably going to have pins.
Right.
You might get to a point where you're like, okay, so now we have multiple products. That former constraint has been solved. Now we actually do have a pin constraint because we have 6 products that require pins, and making all these pins has become a bottleneck for us. Now is the time we tackle this pin machine, and we really get this dialed. And this is a core part of our, our in-house engineering and what's the word, like trade secret or something for how we make our product as good as we do.
At the cost, yeah. I think the answer is definitely hire someone. I think as a small business that's sort of bootstrapping it.
Yeah, it's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying.
I can afford it, but it is, I wonder, I think it feels crazy little bit.
You feel like you can't afford it, like hard stop, like full stop, just like, we could just do this tomorrow and be fine.
Yeah. We would not run out of cash. That said, allegedly the point of doing this is to make some money. And that is partially, like, that would affect my ability to pay myself. Again, that would be okay.
So full stop, it's not quite. It's like you can.
No, I'm underpaying myself currently.
Yeah.
And I was sort of like, maybe I should increase my pay.
Yeah.
And I've been underpaying myself from the beginning, like from a market sense, drastically, right? And so the goal there is build value, and you're sort of saying like, one day I like this, like we'll grow this, and there's a plan, and we're seeing results, and it all looks good.
Yeah,
and it's fun.
Well, no, I think if that's part of the equation, I think then, like the full stop answer is no, we can't hire somebody yet.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the most expensive part of what I'm doing is opportunity cost.
True.
And so,
as we pointed out last week.
yeah. And so the biggest real, like, there's the other way of looking at it would be like, who cares if I'm not making money this year, if that's okay, or not making much money.
Yeah.
Personally, if I can get to a place where I get the business to a place where it is generating the amount of money that I want it to generate, which I think is totally doable. But I think there's some risk in, who was it who said predictions are hard, especially about the future?
Yeah.
Some physicist, I'm forgetting his name. Anyway. Right. So like there's a degree of risk to that of like maybe in 2 years it's like, oh, I didn't foresee that. And I spent all the money the business was making on growth.
Yeah.
Which gets into the model of startups.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. So it's tough.
It is.
I think part-time may be the answer.
A part-time person?
Maybe. The thing is part-time for like big juicy projects is really difficult.
I would like a very qualified, exceptional candidate.
For
Can
cheap.
I hire them for 15 hours a week?
At a low hourly.
Yeah. How does that sound, guys?
Yeah. That's what I need. So if anyone's listening.
Yeah. And you happen to have a small child and don't want to work a lot. Really value your lifestyle, but are super talented. Come talk to Uriel.
Yeah, exactly.
Those people do exist.
They exist. Yeah.
My future bookkeeper.
Yeah.
Worked in corporate finance as an accountant, then worked for a CPA. Then she had a kid and kind of took a break and was kind of thinking about going back to the corporate world and was like, I don't know if I want to do that. I think I want to work 30 hours a week. Doing this, and there's a big need in the community where we both live. There's a lot of self-employed kind of self-starter type people.
Interesting.
Who know nothing about bookkeeping.
Right.
Most of us. And so I think she'll be pretty successful and get to kind of, that seems like a perfect way to be self-employed, is like you just have this like fantastic marketable skill that is very low overhead. Yeah. And you sort of like set your limit on how much you want to work. Right. The way we're doing it is not the ideal. But
no, that said, before this, I was just talking to someone about this. I used to do consulting and like R&D basically. Yeah. And the pay was much better. Yeah. That said, the stability and the ability to plan your life was way worse. Yeah. Where if someone came to you with a really cool project and they had the budget and they're like, all right, we need you. It's really hard to turn it down. And it's also because of the nature of the stuff I was consulting on, which isn't this like ongoing bookkeeping need. Mm-hmm. It was like these big projects that were extremely time sensitive. Yeah. They were like, we need you now and a lot. It's not like, okay, I'll do like 10 hours a week. They're like, no. Absolutely not.
There's like a few things that seem to work really well for self-employment style. And I think generally if you have like an ongoing regular need for some skill that just requires you and a computer, right, and extremely low overhead, seems like a great win.
Next life, that's my plan.
Yeah, right.
Just gonna work on a computer. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I forgot what we were talking about, but we had a little interesting thing this last week. I was feeling, as I mentioned, like we're doing all this work, needing another person. I was feeling personally very behind on the aspects of working in the business that I do. Yeah. And last Monday during our morning meeting, I was like, I just really need a day to catch up. Mm-hmm. And so I think we're going to put the brakes on like focusing on production and trying to like scramble to get all the machines up and running. Yeah. Let's just like, I think we just picked kind of like two like easy wins, a machine that was, or two jobs basically that were like quick and easy to set up and just get them running to kind of keep some things moving. Mm-hmm. But I was like, you guys focus on improvement stuff for the day. We had a whole list of things that's been building up. I'm going to try and get caught up on stuff not just programming, but all this other stuff that was kind of hanging over my head. And it was, I don't know, somehow it was, I put it in our sheet as we took a break to catch up, but it sort of worked. Doing this sort of like hard stop, like reset, sort of allowed us to all take a deep breath and move back into production in a much smoother way. It was like palpable, the change in everybody's mood in the shop. All of a sudden there was like jokes being cracked and a lot more smiles, and
interesting.
And I don't feel like there was no detriment. It was just kind of like coming back to our quote of like glass half full, half empty, or too big. It was kind of just like coming to terms with like the actual state of where we were at. And it was like, okay, rushing, trying to scramble is not actually going to get, like, we only have so much labor. We can only do so much work. So let's just do it methodically.
Yeah.
And it really worked out well. And I feel like we never stopped production completely. And by Thursday, we were into like a really good groove. So it was just kind of an interesting mind perspective change that was really helpful.
That's cool. I think I've had that just personally, those days when it's like I'm supposed to have done 10 things by the end of the day, and you're sort of like spend the whole day jumping from thing to thing, and by the end none of them are really done, and you never really just, I think it's sort of similar. It's like, and then there are the days where you're like, you know what, I'm going to forget about all those things and I'm just going to work on this one because it needs, and then by the end of the day, like the feeling is very different, and I think you often accomplish more in a funny way. Yeah. Where it's like, well, forgetting all those things, I'm not going to bother being stressed out or like running around with my head on fire. I'm just going to move through this methodically and get through it. That's cool. I wonder how you build. It feels like confidence in your systems could get you to a state where that's always the feeling, where sort of like your new job board, or not that new anymore, but if every day you looked at that and that really drove the business, I could imagine there being some sort of like calm in knowing that it's very well thought out of what needs to happen when, and when things are triggered, they actually need to happen. I've seen that a bit with our Kanbans. When they trigger, there are ones that absolutely have to get done. And when those trigger, there's this funny, I don't know if calm maybe is an overstatement, but it's just like, this needs to happen. It's very simple, I guess is what it is.
Right.
It's very easy. It's very simple.
There's not a lot of like parsing and
like, well, we could do this first, or we could do it a little later. We could do it before lunch or after lunch. We could do it tomorrow and do this other thing today. And it's like, no, this just needs to happen. Yeah. I don't know.
It's a good goal.
Yeah. Anyway, I think that about does it.
Yeah, it's a good place to wrap up.
Thanks all for listening. You can find me at austere manufacturing. Austere _ manufacturing on Instagram.
You can find me at lichen_MFG on Instagram, though I've been taking a break. So if I don't get back to you right away, sorry.
And then you can find the podcast at Incremental CI on Instagram. Thanks for tagging us. Sorry, we've missed a couple of them in reposting to our stories. We're trying to stay on top of it. Yeah,
I think that's it. Thank you all.